As the UK Defence Attache to the Russian Federation from 2019 to 2022, John Foreman advised senior UK officials and ministers on Russian military and security affairs and represented the UK Chief of Defence Staff to the Russian General Staff. He had a front row seat for the tense meetings and negotiations that immediately preceded Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine in February 2022. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to see more of the amazing speakers that we feature, and do consider becoming a patron to support the work of the channel, or buy me a coffee. John Foreman is an independent consultant specialising in Russia, Ukraine and international security, with over 20 years of diplomatic, operational and corporate experience in the defence and security sector. He facilitated the largest UK ministerial defence visit to Moscow since 1944, negotiated a bilateral treaty to reduce operational risk, and informed UK-Russia policy and strategy. Currently, he is a visiting lecturer to King's College London, a mentor to future UK defence attaches and advisors, and a RAND Europe associate. He has a lifelong interest in Russia, Ukraine, their languages, peoples, cultures, and histories. He was appointed CBE in the 2023 New Year's Honours for his service. John, it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the channel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nice to be here. I should just point out, I was also the Defence Attache in Ukraine from 2008 to 2011. So, as I'm sure in the conversation will come up, I am firmly behind the Ukrainian victory. And it was very difficult for me when I was in Moscow to see the people I was working with in Moscow attacking the people I knew and worked with in Kiev. And I still find that very emotional.
It must feel personal, I think, as it does to Ukrainians, and especially Ukrainians who have had friends and family in Russia. I mean, many have communicated to me the shock on realizing that their relatives, sometimes even close relatives, not only weren't that interested in what was going on, but actively disbelieved their reports that they were telling about, the Russian attacks and the Russian invasion. So before we get into the whole sort of geopolitics of that, this is personal for you, and you have very clear views on the outcomes, or the required outcomes.
Yeah, I do. I think we'll get into that. I mean, I think when you live in a country like Kiev and you see sort of struggles through, and I was there about 10, 15 years ago, and now really this is the Ukrainian War of independence. People said in 1991 that Ukraine became accidentally independent at the end of the Soviet Union. And we went through, 25 years or so of corruption, change of government, a lack of a real direction where the country was going. We saw previous attempts by Russia to exert influence, by poisoning presidential candidates or interfering in the electoral process, of course, in the Maidan, annexation. But I think this is now you're seeing a country, a free, proud, democratic country being born in front of our eyes. So it is emotional for me because my friends still work at the British Embassy. On the night of the invasion, I was sat in my flat in Moscow looking at the pictures coming out of Kiev as the missiles landed, and that people were showing on the social media the bombs and the windows being smashed in, and these are people I know quite well. So yes, it has been difficult. Of course, as each stage of Russians' terrible atrocities towards Ukrainians continue, it's only redoubled my desire to see Ukraine win, not just survive, but win and prosper in the future as part of the European family. And
you say it's almost sort of accidental, but Ukraine has tried to break free of Moscow's vice-like grip a number of times in the past, and one could almost say that the Soviet Union collapsed accidentally as well, that it wasn't through a conscious process of decolonization. Therefore, there wasn't any kind of strategic decision to do that. And what we're now seeing perhaps in the revanchism of Moscow is an attempt to reverse those accidental lapse of, say, power. Is that the impression you have around this, that it's colonial, it's not just a sort of realist or rationalized geopolitical struggle?
No, the whole thing, from the Russian perspective, this is a colonial war, not one driven by a balance of considerations of positives and negatives to make a decision. It's because the powers that be in Russia don't believe in Ukraine as an independent country, or as Ukrainians as a people with no rights. They see them, as many centuries of Russian rulers have seen them, as basically errant Slavs who should be brought back under the heel. I think that trend has only just accelerated under Putin. But I think President Yushchenko, when I was in Kiev, used to say that listen, we've won independence, but we sought independence 4 times, so we've lost it 3 times. This is the longest period of Ukrainian independence in its entire history. I know in 1991, the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, as was, basically put a motion for independence to the delegates and said, look, lads, we have to vote on this, otherwise we're in the shit. That's what he said. So, but now we're past the 30-year mark. The country's been born through a war. It needs to be. We can only support its aims, its aspirations to break free from the Russian grip. And I think actually some Russian writers also point out Ukraine becoming a sovereign, democratic, independent country will send a powerful message to Russians themselves that Russians can also live in democracy. They don't have to accept the sort of narrative from Putin's side that Russians have to live under dictatorship, which has been a prevailing myth for 200 or 300 years.
That's right. Well, we'll come on to the myths and propagandist tropes, of which I think sort of NATO and this idea that Russians are intrinsically, genetically incapable of democracy are 2 of the classic ones inherited from the Soviet Union, which still have potency and power. But given all the things that you saw, and given the behavior of Putin as it's unfolded over the last 20 years, and indeed behaviors that predate Putin as well, even in the 90s, did we miss the patterns and warnings of increasingly aggressive, belligerent behavior? Did we choose self-interest rather than wanting to really examine what was going on and the direction of travel?
I think we've been guilty of wishful thinking for the last at least 20 years. One might say since the failure of Russian democracy in 1993, when Yeltsin shelled the White House and basically engineered more powers to come to the presidency. At each stage, there's been an act in Moscow and then some sort of reset. We wished that when Mr. Putin came, he was some sort of proto-democrat who we could work with, but very quickly, the way he treated the Chechens, the way he was treating his own people, tried to treating the oligarchs, his interference in Ukraine. There's been a whole pattern of behaviour. I was in the lecture room with David Miliband in 2008, and he came and said, Russia's invasion of Georgia is a powerful wake-up call to Europe. We must react to this. We did wake up, we slept on. So I wrote down here, 2013 in Syria, Russia's belligerence there. Obama blinks. We've got the reset under Obama. You've got 2014 annexation. So there's lots of rhetoric, but actually the actions we took were substandard. So it's not just in terms of foreign policy, it's also in terms of the creeping oppression at home. And in my time there, we had Navalny's attempted murder in 2020, we've got arrests and closures of the free press, build up around Ukraine. So I think the warning signs are there. And I think if you go back, I wrote to my ministers maybe end of 2021, beginning of 22, I had some realization over a beer. So you could start to put the pieces together in Putin's head. Maybe he had a firm strategy, but certainly everything was pointing towards trying to sort the Ukrainian problem out in 2022. But actually, the antecedents of this go way, way back. And subsequent numbers of leaders have come and sort of sought to accommodate and say, this is the time. They'll come to Moscow, they'll speak to Putin, they'll sort it out. But actually, he's laughed in their face. And he saw us as weak, and that has encouraged him to take this step.
And that's a really interesting point about weakness, because one of the strategies Russia has adopted as an empire, I think, over a number of 100 years, is to probe weakness, probe areas where often with its weak state and weak military, nonetheless, it can still achieve successes. That doesn't seem to have changed in any respect. But the strategic muddle or our failure to observe the patterns and warnings of Russian aggression, that also gives a signal the other way, doesn't it? It suggests that even though we have theoretical red lines, we can vocalize them, we're not actually prepared to stand up for them or fight for them when those red lines are contravened. What is the history of the West? What signals did we give out that we were not going to invade red lines? And could that in some way have led to Putin believing he would get away with his Ukrainian adventure?
Well, I think we give three examples. Firstly, trade weakness is the red line around sad use of chemical weapons in 2013, and the rhetoric to say that we cannot have a country gassing its own people. And then Obama blinked and didn't do anything about it. So I think Putin took solace from that. I think I've written here 2014, annexation of Crimea, starting a dirty war in Donbass. Very quickly, certain European powers, particularly under Germany, are doing deals over Nord Stream. They're trying to put in place the dismemberment of Ukraine as some sort of quote-unquote federal relationship, trying to seek a peace deal at the expense of Ukrainians living under occupation in eastern Ukraine. And I think also perhaps 2021, the first Russian build-up around Crimea, when there was lots of panic to say this is going to be an invasion of Ukraine in the spring of 21. Biden offered a summit in Geneva as a response to that. And a very senior Russian journalist told me that he thought that Putin assessed Biden's a weak old man. So we set these red lines without actually following them through. So I think we've all been guilty of it. I think we're not recognizing the gathering storm coming from Russia. The antecedents of this, the reasons aren't just under Putin. We go way back. Ukraine was always seen to be seen as unfinished business, but there were still those who wanted to turn the page. Even when I arrived in Moscow, people in London sort of talking around, but it's been 18 months since Skripal poisoning. Now it's time to do something else. We need to work together on climate change or science, technology, cooperation, the high North Arctic science, whatever. But actually, I said at the time, I thought that was naive. I thought we were just sort of talking around the edges of the key problem. The situation is getting worse. It's going to get worse. There is no life in this huddle, and we have to be prepared for what's coming down the rail tracks towards us.
We'll come to the unfinished business because I think there's a wider civilizational clash of values question out of that. But let's continue with the mindset of Putin. It makes things easier, doesn't it, if we label him as a monster, as a genocidal lunatic, as a paranoic. Undoubtedly, there's elements of paranoia there, but if we actually try to think of him as a rational actor, the stuff that we see, the stuff that's almost incomprehensible to us, full-scale war in Ukraine, from his perspective, are there rational reasons for him to have thought last year that he could be victorious? Are there rational reasons for him to believe now that he could still be victorious on his own terms and divide the West and eventually achieve his goals, whatever they may be?
Well, I think, what was his theory of victory? His theory of victory was, in his own mind, what's been reported to him, that Ukraine is a weak and divided state.
Here's some news about a victory.
That the West will not stand up in case of Russia's aggression, that the West will also be divided again. Ukraine will fall quickly, the Russian army to be modernized. And this is not just the Ukrainian question. This is an attempt to reset the security arrangements in Europe, as we saw in those draft security treaties before the invasion. This is part of the whole plan, and then part of a wider strategy for Ukraine, for Russia and China to actually have spheres of influence around the world, multipolar, and Russia's reasserting itself as a great power. So I think he had a theory of victory, turned out to be incorrect and was disproven quite quickly. But I think we had these long discussions in the embassy about is Putin rational, and people who spoke to him at the very senior levels always came back and said he was rational in his conversations with him. And people who spoke to him direct in the Russian system told us that he was rational. But I think we have to assess that he was rational in his own way, through his seeing things through his own lens. So what you and I will regarded as mad and imperialistic and evil, perhaps, is seen through him as trying to achieve those objectives he once set himself. But I think also he's definitely changed. He's not the man he was 20 years ago. And I think, we all said it's been discussed about the effect of the pandemic, the effect of approaching 70, being in power 20 years, the effect of purging any form of opposition inside his own system, so the whole system's telling him the same thing. They're surrounding himself with cronies and criminals, I think, has definitely clouded his decision-making capability. So whether he's rational or he's rational in his own way, but I do think the wider point is, I think you alluded to it, we mustn't other these people, other than the Russians. All Russians are drunken, bears, vodka-swilling, aggressive maniacs. I think you see it pushed around quite a lot as part of the conversation. There's quotes about myth of Russia's enigma, etc., etc. I think it's unhelpful. We have to rethink and look at Russia as it is, not as we want it to be, whether before the invasion and now.
And another aspect, which he must be looking at in a fairly sort of rational manner, this is perhaps one of the more frustrating, is that we do seem to have escalation paralysis. We eventually do the right thing and supply Ukraine with what it needs. But before that happens, there seems to be either bureaucratic inertia or, because I'm sure that can always be overcome, it's more a fear of this so-called escalation. In fact, it's falling into the trap of Russian terroristic narratives, or even, dare I say it, just the failure to react to extreme inhumanity. For instance, the Kovka Dam terrorist action and the weak, pusillanimous reaction by both the media and, to an extent, politicians on what is, to my mind, an extraordinary large-scale act of inhumanity and aggression. So what's your view on this escalation paralysis and how it may be driving Russian aggression?
Well, I think certainly there's many camps inside in the West who want things to go back to normal, whatever normal is. And they see, I think some of them saw the original conflict as it's all going to be over quite quickly. I'll have to go back doing business with Putin, that sort of thing. And I think as the sort of scale of the invasion and the war crimes and the sort of genocidal nature, there's been a realization they've really got to sort of to confront the Russian threat more seriously. But I think this escalation, sort of these delays, is just part of a wider problem, not really knowing where we're going. So we started off the British giving NLAWs, the Americans giving Javelin, we come all the way through now to F-16s. It's because there's no strategy, there's no policy to where we want to be. So, as I've said previously, we had this line about sticking with Ukraine as long as it takes without defining what it is. The Nobel Prize laureate female from Ukraine last year said there's a difference between wanting Ukraine not to fall than saying we want Ukraine to win. That was interesting. I've been reading a book recently. I've got it here by John Bew. It's on Clement Attlee. And it's interesting. In 1942, Clement Attlee said the same thing to Churchill. He said it's okay, well and good us supporting the UK fighting alone, America's on the side, whatever. But what are our war goals? Where do we want to go? Not both domestically and also internationally. Because without that, the public won't come with you. You've got to build the public. We've not really set out clear goals on the conflict around Ukraine, either towards Ukraine, i.e. what a victory looks like, and also what towards Russia. So I think then you have this whole problem of arms and supplies. It's dribs and drabs. Now things have got better in 2023, but there's an awful lot of delay. And actually, like I said, how many Ukrainians had to die at the expense of delays in the White House in Germany and other European capitals about supplying arms. And I do think I agree with your point about moral outrage. I think, where is our moral outrage? I mean, obviously, we had the war crimes at Bucha, the murder of children, deportations of rapes, disappearances, of which we know. And we know there must be many, many more examples of war crimes going on. And I think the whole thing has a genocidal flavour. And it's all become a bit sort of, the reaction of the West now become a bit broke, thoughts and prayers. very strongly, deeply concerned by, but actually not really affecting our policy. Like saying, as we did in 1943 when the evidence of the Holocaust came about, to say that the United Nations demand the unconditional surrender of the Nazi regime. So what our goal should be, we can sketch it out, but I think without a clear direction and purpose, we end up sort of bumping along the bottom. And I think we have got ourselves. Russia has sort of induced fear in the West. That's the purpose of Mr. Medvedev. That's the purpose of the propagandists. That's as a blood-curdling threats to do this and that, which don't actually happen. And with that fear, that just ends that to delay and sort of dither, which I described.
Another fear, and I think this is one that needs to be addressed, is that not only are we not imagining what that victory might look like in all its shapes and forms, we are perhaps also creating self-limiting fantasies. One of those is that the disintegration of Russia, the last great European empire and one of the least efficient, most brutal of all of those imperial projects, may well be entering a phase of terminal decay. It seems that our objectives are not just neutral in that respect, but are really creating a bogeyman, fearing that the collapse of Russia could be far bloodier than maintaining the status quo. Whereas I think a case could be made that the opposite is true, that an empire that is continuing as a zombie entity could cause far more chaos, bloodshed, than if it was allowed to swiftly collapse and nature take its course. Do you think this is part of the calculus in Berlin, Washington, Paris, and maybe an extent in London as well?
Yes, I think our policy is certainly not to take measures which ends up with the breakup of Russia itself. I think that's likely, to be honest. I mean, I read the articles, people say that this is the opportunity to break it up into constitutional parts, but the Russian Federation, the remnants of the Russian Empire, without the bits around the outside, there are no sort of alternative sources of power. There's no real alternative governments, alternative elites, and never haven't been for many, many years. So, and the fact the entire approach of Putin is to be just stamped out on that as well. I think we have to deal with the problem in front of us of Russia from the borders of Europe to the borders of the Pacific Ocean. I think the breakup is one option, one scenario, which is least likely. I think the more likely scenario is dealing with a post-war Russia, which could be more accommodating towards seeking to parley with us, or it could be just a continuation of the same, either with Putin or people instead. So I think I tend to not really pay much credence to the whole breakup as a war goal, because I think, for obvious reasons, given it's got the world's largest nuclear arsenal, it's probably not the greatest thing. Plus a population of 140, 50 million people, with that'd be a source of massive instability. We're trying to put Europe back together, not to break it up, but even further.
That suggests then that the strategy, if we're not actively going to seek that, then the strategy ought to be containment. So what are we doing in order to create a proper sort of containment mechanism? Militarily, of course, is the obvious one, but also in terms of fortifying democracy, values, etc., as a bulwark against Russia, which holds very different values and a very different socio-economic system.
Again, I saw that the UK policy in the integrated review refresh is to contain and challenge. So contain in Europe, challenge worldwide. But again, you didn't really give a purpose to that containment. If you go back to the author Keenan in the 1940s about containment was a way to an end, which was the reduction and an ending of Soviet power and some form of post-Soviet rapprochement with the world that had hold the line. So I think, yes, we have to do containment properly. I've termed it more stick and obviously more NATO, credible deterrence, both by punishment and defence inside NATO, adequate defence spending, fighting ratchet up beyond economic sanctions, clamping down on Russian ventures outside of Europe, having greater stick to do with the legal finish on war criminals, getting more of Putin's regime indicted for war crimes, getting the international tribunal on the wars of aggression off the ground, those sort of things. But I think there still has to be a thought about attained to what purpose? What do we want Russia to be? And I think you have to set out a carrot to the Russian people, not necessarily Putin and his crew, to say the door is open for the original vision with James Baker at the end of the Cold War of a Europe free and fair and at peace from Vancouver to Vladivostok. That we were willing to re-engage with Russia when Russia itself was willing to come back to the table, but until that time, we have to hold the line, not just in Europe, but sort of on the flanks as well, Russia.
And before we hit record and during this interview, I think there's a strong indicator here, or a hint, that there's, we've approached Russia with a certain amount of naivety. That includes in the 1990s and especially the early 2000s and prior to full-scale invasion. Are we perhaps guilty that we may approach a post-Putin Russia and the naivety will slip back into it? And we already see some signs of this. For instance, trying to seek out a liberal Russian opposition and projecting our values onto them. Isn't there a risk that whatever follows Putin, and it may be nationalist, it may even be semi-liberal economically, I wouldn't discount that, but neither of those regimes would actively dismantle the power vertical that almost inevitably maybe slips a generation but leads back to where we are at the moment? Should we not be seeking some kind of systemic change, not only to Russia, perhaps not even territorially, but the very economic system that seems to produce autocrats, either every other leader or with a high degree of frequency?
I mean, I read the letter that Mr. Kuramuzar wrote to the Washington Post this week, just before he was in prison for 25 years on completely bogus charges. And he identified the problem of the failure of democracy in 1991. And of course, there's all the Putin rhetoric, but democracy is somehow anathema to the Russian people. The Russians can never want it. And I was in Russia in 1991. I saw the optimism by which Russians approached their new future, bringing words that now they're going to join the European family after 50 years of isolation, terrible crimes of communism, Stalin, whatever. And that was failed quite quickly. But he made the point that the only way out of all this, from now and the future, is of change of regime and democracy. And people say, well, because it failed, it's sort of disappointed. It failed in the 1990s, therefore it can never happen again. We're stuck with Russia as it is. I think that's incorrect. I think there are many Russians disgusted by what's been going on in Ukraine. They want a brighter future for themselves and their children. So I think it's part of that sort of carrot we have to show to the Russian people, to say that until such time as you're willing to come and talk to us properly with a regime, we'll hold the line, but we're willing to hold out the hand of peace in the future. But these are our conditions. And one of those must be we cannot treat or parley with Mr. Putin and his gang of criminals. There has to be a change, a de-securitization of the Russian state. There has to be a whole new set of systems. You have to have the rule of law, not the rule by law. You have to stick to your agreements. Yeah, we will, Reagan said, we'll trust you. If you come to the table, we will verify. There can never be sort of wild optimism in the 1990s that somehow Russia is going to emerge from Putin as Sweden or Switzerland or Austria or whatever. Poland, then move on. I think it's going to be a long process. But we have to be willing, as Reagan said, to sort of hold out, waiting for men of goodwill to come through. But until that time is there, we will hold the line and defend our territories and to defend our values.
And there's a lot of talk about existential threats, and I think the word existential threat means something very different in Ukraine than it does in Moscow. But isn't one of the motivations, perhaps, for what Putin is doing is that what Ukraine has achieved in its 30 years of independence is actually to show a template for how you move from that centralized autocratic power to a much more decentralized and dynamic and evolving, more organic political system. And it's actually that Putin fears. It's the template and the process and the mechanics of how that's achieved, which, if they were to be copied in Russia, would provide a significant challenge to his authority. Now, I know there are historical and cultural reasons why this happened in Ukraine, but it has also shown the mechanics of how you achieve it. And that's extremely dangerous to a system like Russia's.
I think the existential threat is to Putin, his cronies, and his those who take rent from the system, and the criminals are in the system around the president. I think there is. I agreed with a very interesting article by one Russian thinker to say that actually Russians should want Ukraine to be in the EU and NATO, because once Ukraine is in both NATO and the European Union, the justification for huge amounts of weaponry and arms goes completely. There is no, once Ukraine has been broken out freely, it changes the situation completely. It goes back to those the lack of sort of vision and leadership by Western leaders to say we should be actively, as von der Leyen is saying, lobbying to get Ukraine into the European Union and Georgia and Moldova. And also NATO leaders have the same resolve, rather than to keep blurring and fudging the issue each time that it comes up for. So it's a case of, rather than saying why not, why we should be doing this, what for? These are good things both for Ukraine and Ukrainians, but ultimately it's good for Russia, and strategically it's good for our peace. So I think there are templates. You can look at Poland, astonishing. Ukraine, as you said, although I think the pace of change has picked up dramatically since 2014 and even more since 2020, this country being forged through war. They won't put up with the corruption, which the previous power brokers who've raped the country of its funds for 20, 30 years and kept them very poor. This is the moment. Here's the moment to strike. I was speaking to somebody in London this week and said, it's a massive opportunity for us if we grasp this opportunity, both for peace in Europe, which is shattered, according to NATO leaders, for Ukrainians and Belarusians, and also for Russians. Ultimately, through that process, we will live in peace. We can't let it carry on as it is.
And it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because the pace of change has increased in Ukraine. Partly, it has to be said, because of the external pressure that Russia has applied to it. But it has also shown Ukrainians what they can achieve, and it's given, I think, a sense of the future and a sense of hope. Now, in order to clarify and galvanize Western support for Ukrainian victory, is it a useful mental exercise for us to imagine actually what a Russian victory would look like? Not just on the ground in Ukraine, which is horrific enough, but what it would mean in terms of Western European security and what it would mean for the challenge to global rule of law and the institutions that we've tried to build since the post-Second World War period.
I think any Russian victory, temporary on the so-called occupied territories, or indeed over Ukraine, and achieves Putin's war goal of subjugation and breakup and reabsorption, could be a catastrophe for Europe and European security, physical security, and Western values. We went to war in 1939, called it the words of our king at the time, to stand against the principle that might is right. Because one, people that generation realised the consequences not staying up to militarism, and been suffering grievously in the First War, but also what that would send to any people around the world to want to live free and to determine their own futures. That a Russian victory over Ukrainians would galvanise and spring the step of all sorts of autocrats who want to use force to resolve their problems, and it would completely break down system of laws and international security we've tried to put in place since 1945 to avoid these wars. So it'd be a very, very dark world indeed. It would lead to huge costs in spending because we'd have to double our defense spending to stand up against Russia. Russia would be re-energized. I think the absorption of Belarus would continue. What do we do about Moldova? What about the Caucasus? What about Central Asia? All these things will be bad for our security. So imagine that dark future should sort of galvanize Western leaders to think about, okay, if we don't want that, then what sort of future do we want? Presumably it's going to be brighter and work towards that rather than sort of muddling through.
Russia's been described, I'm not sure who by, as a gas station run by a mafia clan. The pressure, however, must be there for Western countries to make accommodations with the regime, even if Ukraine has, a substantial and complete victory in terms of its territorial, getting its, territorial lands back. Isn't there a fundamental conflict between the idea of actually getting justice for the crimes that have been committed, but also that self-interested drive to perhaps make accommodations with the regime? Now, it may not be Putin himself, but it may be his sort of acolyte and Putinistas that remain in power. Should we eschew any kind of dealings with Putinism, even in a post-Putin world, as a sort of betrayal of our values and incompatible with getting, proper restitution for Ukraine?
Yes, I think it was John McCain who said that Russia was a mafia clan running a gas station. And of course, actually, the European states and the world have taken a huge step up reducing its dependency on Russian energy, which is one of the major drivers of how Russia exerted influence, dirty money into Europe. But there's further to go. I think there's further to go on sanctions. There's further to go on, as I said, on seeking justice for the war crimes and acts like that. I think in terms of accommodating, I think Russia's not going away. The Russian issue is not going away. We can't wish it away. It's 3.5 hours from London. It's country, 150 million people, has quite a large economy, has resources, has intellectual capital. It can succeed. I think there cannot be any dealing with the current regime, those directly implicated in the crimes in Ukraine. Now, whether somebody from the system emerges, and I said before, we had Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, all these people's hands soaked in blood, Chernenko. And ultimately, it was Gorbachev as a person who was that man of goodwill that Reagan spoke about, which Mrs. Thatcher made the point at Reagan's funeral. Reagan said we had to hold the line till these people come through. Are there people in the system? Yes, but of course, if you don't give a version of what's on the table, should Russia seek to turn the corner, then you can't parley with Bortnikov, Steliepsky, or Patrushev, whichever old man comes next. There has to be a clearing of the stables. And again, I think the impact of the ICC indicting Putin for war crimes, so it's really interesting, set a powerful message, not just inside Russia, but also globally, and the problems of Putin not able to travel, his isolation. We should do the same to Lavrov. We should do the same to those propagandists who've been threatening, all sorts of crimes in Ukrainian people, Shoigu and Gerasimov, key leaders, the sort of financiers, propagandists. Those are the power system, brought the system to this point, or the country to this point, and then say whoever comes next cannot be from that game.
So draw the venom out of the system, so to speak, and that could only happen, could it not, with a substantial military victory on the part of Ukraine, perhaps a swifter one as well, that really humiliates Putin and causes an outright rejection of his clique that led to such a disaster. How critical is retaking Crimea to that sense, not only of victory for Ukraine itself, but in order to catalyze some kind of change in Russia?
I think that's the Ukrainian theory of victory. I mean, I think we'll still focus on Crimea. Yes, Crimea is a vital ground, as Ben Hodges says, but it's not just about Crimea. It's sending. I mean, Russia still has a large population, and it probably has more stuff than Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are fighting at disadvantage. The Ukrainian theory of victory is to cause a defeat, which then resonates back in the Russians. So that's why you see the Ukrainians are taking the battle to Russia and the occupied territories, like we saw last night in Sevastopol, as we saw bombers up by the Estonian border, or in Russia, in Moscow itself, plus assassinations, so quote partisan activity. So I think that is, if you say the tactical successes in the field lead to an ability to implement change in Crimea and make it untenable, which then sends a message to the system at strategic levels to say, hold on, we're losing here. Now, the offensive so far, so the current phase of the land part of the offensive has been slower than people wished, probably back to that dithering, because we didn't give the Ukrainians all the equipment, all the training they needed to get before they launched in June. And there was lots of, well, come on, lad, you need to use this stuff we've given you. But actually, from the leaks we saw from that airman, it seemed to me that there's quite substantial gaps in the Ukrainian armed forces. They've achieved some success. If they achieve more, you can always see the sort of nervousness about Putin in his speeches. He's having to lie about the number of losses the Ukrainians have suffered over the last few months. So the only hope for Russia is a defeat by Ukraine and the restoration of its borders. And the defeat ends up leading to regime change in Russia. And the current gang of criminals is swept out of the way. That's the only hope for Russia. Now, all the other scenarios are possible, but that's one I think we should be focusing on, saying that regime change is not just but Blinken says we don't seek regime change. I think we do seek regime change, because of that regime change, all the problems we've currently got are just going to continue. And the Putinism and the next phase of it will just be, repeat and rewash and redux and repeat and ad infinitum.
Of course, it won't solve all Russia's problems, but it will solve some of the immediate ones, as you've said, and potentially it clears the field for other, perhaps more inventive, creative people to come to the fore.
I think we shouldn't be doing Putin. Sorry, we shouldn't be doing Putin's job for him. And Putin wants to send this narrative that he is the leader of a unified nation, which is Eurasian, which is unique civilization, and that sort of stuff. All the stuff he's written down, that everybody's 100% behind him. And we shouldn't do the same thing to say, right, all the Russians over there, all of them, from Putin down to the lowest, mechanic in Vladivostok, are all marching in the same direction. It's not true, in my experience, and what Putin tells us. And what Russians tell me is there's a huge body of people who are in the middle of all this and just keeping their heads down. They're not madly anti-war, not madly for war. This is a battle of ideas. And Putin has his big idea. What's our big idea to confront that, and how we getting this across to the Russian people? We have to have something to say, rather than just concentrating on the means to say this by internet and TV. You have to have a clear message, like we did to those in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, during the Cold War, and also indeed into Germany, that justice would be dealt with both the guilty. But there was a path forward. Look at where Germany and Japan are now in comparison to where they were in 1945. But both of those was predicated on a military defeat.
I mean, the cynical point of view has been expressed, and I fear there is some truth in it, and that is that Russians do not punish their leaders for brutality, strength, and military success. In fact, whatever is required to achieve those is not questioned. The only thing they punish their leaders for is defeat and failure. And perhaps we won't see Russians really actively doing anything until the defeat is tangible and incontrovertible.
No, I thought we talked about the routes last year in Kharkiv and Kherson. I mean, at the time, if Ukraine had the will, the means to continue its advances and didn't run out of steam because they didn't have the equipment, then the route would have got bigger. Do you remember those stories about Kherson? that the Russians retreated back across the river. That wasn't a rout. They actually withdrew in quite good order. Now, imagine if they'd been routed, thousands of prisoners taken, thousands of bodies floated down the river. That would have sent a much more powerful message to the Russian people. So Putin was able to say, well, that was a tactical withdrawal. Kharkiv was also a straightening of our lines and whatever. I think you have to show, as the Ukrainians say, and I agree, you have to bring the war home to Russians, not in terms of bodies, in terms of standard of living, and also as a realization that the country's going nowhere. And I think that people do realize that. But of course, Russia's one of those countries changes rarely, but when it does, changes quickly. How do you anticipate that? What are the warning signs? Why do people, I wouldn't have expected a boarding warlord to march on Moscow in June, but he did. So there's obviously massive tension and degradation of the system. This is what's that point where you have to push. I think it comes from visible success on the battlefield and visible difficulties at home.
I always thought of it like tectonic plates. You don't know when the big one's coming, but it's not like an incrementally changing democratic system. It builds up vast amounts of pressures and forces, which can then be unleashed in very unpredictable ways, and that's to be hoped, of course.
The CIA, the CIA didn't predict the end of the Soviet Union in its yearbook, famously, because there's that message. That was the thing. There's some people who it's always been like this. It's always going to be like that. What can we do? We have to accommodate. And actually the pressures we, the West, put into the system, as well as people of goodwill, ended up bringing everything down. So we shouldn't be despondent. As I said, we can affect the situation. We don't have to sit here and wait if it all just to fall to pieces, which I think is probably the strategy at the moment, and pick the pieces up afterwards. We should be getting on the front foot and not just be on the back foot on the defensive.
There's the infamous quote, I think, from Margaret Thatcher in the Verkhovna Rada, where asked if she was going to open an embassy in Kiev, said, well, we don't have one in Texas. Why would we have one here? Mm-hmm. And then a year later, they achieved full independence. Well, the last question...
George Bush's Chicken Kiev speech.
Yes.
Famously. So, prediction is difficult, but I think the direction of travel was known because Reagan had said it and Thatcher had said it. We wanted to liberate people. We did from tyranny. We wanted to not acquiesce with a slave master who are keeping people slaves. We believed in a better future at some stage, but until that was the case, we had to stand up for what we believed in, rather than just accommodating or signing treaties and hoping the whole thing would sort of go away and keep itself over there.
And the last question, I think, is appropriate to end on Ukraine and Ukrainians rather than Russians. And the question there is, what can we learn from what Ukraine has achieved, not just in Maidan and the various revolutions, but the characteristic of the Ukrainian horizontal battling against the Russian vertical. There are many areas, from technology to innovation to military tactics, and also the area that I'm particularly interested in, which is disinformation. Ukraine seems to be innovating techniques that create space for freedom and push back autocracy. What ought we be studying and learning from Ukraine's innovations and resilience, which perhaps we're not fully learning yet?
Of course, if Ukraine had put a lot of those effort into it before the invasion, then its defences would have been stronger. And of course, that's a realisation that there's more that could have been done beforehand. I think people just didn't want to believe that Russia would invade. But I think I'm inspired by what Ukrainians do every day. I think the spirit, I think the civil society is a very strong thing. There was a saying when I was in Kiev that Ukraine had weak institutions and strong civil society, and Russia had strong institutions and weak civil society. It shows to me benefits of strong civil society and other checks and balances. The people, the anti-corruption work, the innovation, the support networks, which have endured in Ukraine for hundreds of years because of Russian oppression. They inspire me, and we can learn from that. But we shouldn't wait for the government to tell us what to do. we should be using civil society and getting about, forming those networks locally to actually solve problems. I think war is the mother of invention, as people say. I think innovation, how the Ukrainians have pinpointed Russian weaknesses and gone after them, how it's been a whole of nation effort. You've got computer scientists and engineers coming up with all sorts of new weapons because of their disproportionate capabilities to take the battle both at sea, in the air, and on the land to the Russians. But I think I wouldn't say battle disinformation. I think it's actually communicating clearly. Ukrainian government communications and civil society communications are excellent, and they really resonate. And they resonate with us, the British and the Americans. I've thought about this. Why is that? Why does the Ukrainian issue dilemma for them resonate so strongly with us? Because Ukrainians remind us of ourselves, what things are important. Standing up for principle, family, civil society, fighting, putting your life on the line for something. We always say that we fought alone in 1940, but I think Boris Johnson recognised that key linkage. That's why we welcomed 150,000 Ukrainians to our homes in the last 18 months. Why the UK has been one of the strongest leaders, because the Ukrainian is ultimately fighting their war for us and all our freedoms. And that's what inspires me, that teaches me there are some things worth fighting for.
And I think that resonates incredibly strongly, and especially, I was in Ukraine for the first time earlier in the year, and then that came across strongly. They're fighting for a way of life that has genuine sort of immense value to them, but it's also a very good way of life, which is worth fighting for. John, it's been a huge privilege to be able to point these questions at you and get the benefit of your experience, including extraordinary experience with that front row seat as history was unfolding. Thank you so much, and I know this will be greatly appreciated by the audience of the channel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated.